2025. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, even a joke. Mic test. Okay, it's okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Um, Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone here present with us this afternoon to our Forward Fridays conversation that happened in the museum. We have our conversations every single Friday starting from 1 to 2 p.m. during our lunch hour to accommodate everyone to be able to come and engage on conversations that the museum feels are pertinent in terms of moving and taking the university forward in terms of the landscape of higher education and transformation. So today we have a guest, which I'm sure is familiar to everybody, Prof Ronelle Carolissen. She is the Vice Dean of Teaching and Learning in our Education faculty, and today she'll be speaking on her topic, is misrecognition key to the future of higher education? So what's going to happen is that Prof will give a presentation, and thereafter I'll open up for any questions, clarifications, or whatever the likes that we might have from the audience. And then afterwards we'll wrap up and we have something great to eat. So without taking any further time, I'd like to welcome Prof to start with her presentation.
Thank you very much, and indeed well privileged to be here and to talk to you and on a topic that is really quite important to me. I'm going to take this out, and then I'm going to put this to the side, and then I'm going to speak like this. That's much better. Now I feel secure behind this on this podium. Right, so thanks very much for taking the time to come and listen to my talk today. I'm going to talk about misrecognition, and you'll see the misses in brackets, because in fact it would assume recognition too. Is it key to the future of higher education in Africa? And I wouldn't put down a topic like this and to let the cat out of the bag without at the end saying, indeed, I think it is very important. If you look at these two slides, the slide and the two images I put on the slide, it was taken from two editions of the University World News Africa edition in February this year. One just coming out on last week. So the kinds of issues that you will see or that are currently being discussed in various African countries. So for example, in Zambia, Zimbabwe, the destitute students abroad struggle to stay within the law. It's about an issue that students are having or resorting to illegal means to gain money to fund their studies. And then you will see, sorry, I'm just doing this, in Algeria and Zambia respectively, an issue of student murders prompt calls for improved security. And then in Zambia, students act over scrapped meal allowances. And those kind of issues sound very similar. So let me just read a few more from the previous two weeks ago, the Africa edition of the University World News 2 years ago, some of the headings in Ghana, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe respectively. In Ghana, universities must explore alternate ways to fund staff. And then increasing the visibility of journals, an issue in Ethiopia. And then in Zimbabwe, the state violence against women, students show solidarity. So look, if one looks at those headings, what is very clear is that higher education across Africa is very much a turbulent ride in a plane. But I think And so I think it's a very important contextual and departure point from which we should perhaps begin to look at it, because clearly, in the face of all this kind of reports of turbulence, there's clearly enormous growth as well. So in the last decade, if we look at the next slide, there've been, I just want to go back. And in the last decade, what is very important to recognize is that there's been major policy shifts in higher education in Africa, with a massive demand for education and major growth in providers, and enormous progress in information and communication technologies. But, as I hinted, it coexists with huge issues regarding unemployment, unemployed and unemployable graduates, diminishing staff. And I think it's important to look at these kinds of issues. If you look at that graph, I always like to see which graphs are up. And I'll go next. If you look at this graph, you will notice that this is the South African context, the one that speaks to declining the funding of universities and the socio-political context. So from the year 2000, there's declining government subsidies to higher education, and that really reached a peak crisis in 2011 to 2013. I know I've got very little time, so I'm not going to go into the detail. I think a large university like Wits, for example, in 2000 was receiving a 70% subsidy from the national government, and about 35% subsidy from in 2011-2013 period. So at the same time, if we think about that as a continuum, universities increased student fees steadily, and I think what we see there is that if one reads the initial analysis of a book, for example, that Jonathan Johnson writes, As by the Fire, what becomes very clear is that, and he's not the only commentator or scholar that writes about that, it becomes very clear that vice rectors in South Africa could see that with decreased funding and increasing student needs and fees, that we were heading for a really difficult experience in higher education. And that challenge came in 2015, as many of us know, where in fact the system could not sustain, and now I'm going to say it as it is, the system of capitalism that was driving higher education. And so, but there's always a tension between what students need and staff and to run a university, but also what it costs to do that. So those, and funding. And so those two tensions and an almost irreconcilable, it's a paradox essentially, irreconcilable kind of opposites that needed to be balanced within higher education was very important to consider. And so we saw some of the effects, and there are multiple levels of analysis, but I'm looking at the financial model. So I want to look, and I'm just giving the example of South Africa in this instance, but it's very much the pattern of funding in higher education globally. We are not exempt from it, and neither is any other country. So I want to draw on this resource as well. And I'm going to draw on this resource, you know, the United Nations Development Program and the goals, the SDG goals. And I'm going to look at Fraser's participatory parity, the framework for participatory parity, and then think about that in relation to what I just spoke about. I think many of you will be familiar with the 17 development goals, and I think in many ways they don't exist in isolation. I think what happens is that these goals impact on and are impacted by the various, by each other. But I think what is particularly pertinent to issues of misrecognition is number 3, 4, 5, and 10. The questions of inequality, which is, of course, one people like to talk about big issues in the humanities and social sciences. Well, education is a big issue. Gender is a big issue in the humanities and social sciences, and certainly inequality as well as violence. And those issues, it's almost as if education cuts across all of those. In fact, all of these goals, but I want to focus on those particular. I want to single them out. If one thinks of Fraser's participatory parity, she has 3 aspects to it. There are 3 aspects to it. Redistribution, so talking about, and distribution, so the material reallocation of resources, then recognition or misrecognition of the cultural impacts, the importance of recognizing people's cultural aspects, and then representation, as I said there. And I'm going to focus in the very brief time that I have available on, very briefly, on misrecognition and recognition. You know, when Fraser talked about participatory parity, she said for justice to exist, we must actually have all 3 in place. We cannot have representation and redistribution without recognition, cultural recognition. I think what is important there, the cultural sphere that she talked about was referred to by Fraser, denotes the ways in which people's attributes are valued or devalued. As she explains in a multiple works, 2005, 2008, 2009, she talks about how it's either recognized, these attributes, or misrecognized. And I think what is really important here, I want to go back to that, how that is recognized or misrecognized, I just want to move down on my notes. And she said, being either recognized or misrecognized in one's differential access to material resources would have dire consequences for being able to participate as peers in higher education and in the broader higher education context. In 2010, before issues of food insecurity came very much to the fore, a student of mine and I, Nazneen Furfuri and I, published a paper showing how the dynamics of poverty in higher education impact on poor students' ability, for example, to do very practical things like handing assignments timeously, and how shame about poverty, constructed as the individual's fault, perpetuates silences about the existence of poverty among students in higher education. Well, 5 years later, that became very much part of the dominant discourse. Now, the microdynamics of poverty, and that's what I'm interested in, the microdynamics of engagement remain invisible and impact throughput rates, but are minimally addressed because of their invisibility. So in simple terms, if we don't know what exists, we can't do anything to change it. So, that is why my colleague and I, Rob and I, after 4 years' work, brought out this book at the beginning of the year called Transforming Transformation in Research and Teaching in Higher Education. I think and it's by Sun Media. What is particularly interesting in this book is that it focused on complexities and the intertwining of identities. We didn't just focus, for example, on race or gender or language. We looked at how those aspects of people of culture are significantly intertwined in very complex ways, and how, in fact, and in this book we look largely at students, how, in fact, students navigate educational spaces, higher educational spaces, because of and in spite of these various identities that they attract. And I think what this book showed is the value of ethnographic and qualitative research. And I think it's really important that we use this kind of research to understand the dynamics, precisely because it helps us to understand what we must do about it. So, as I said, the microdynamics of contextual experiences of students and staff in higher education. My next big project is going to be working with staff in higher education. And it's a project across Stellenbosch, very small component. It's located at UKZN, DUT, and the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in the US. Now, I think what is very interesting, which is also linked to a project with colleagues in Ghana and Sudan, which is important for thinking about Africa. So, in conclusion, I think some of the kinds of issues that I was trying to raise, or the kinds of issues that I want to highlight, is really the question, is recognition important to the future of higher education? And for me, it's a resounding yes. I think it is, of course, not the only thing. But I think if we don't get this right, because it's so closely linked to inequality, we will certainly not get higher education right. And if we don't get higher education right, we cannot, in fact, have a stronger impact on different levels of education, such as secondary, primary, and early childhood education. So, very briefly then in my talk, just to summarize, is that I've argued from the perspective, and I've linked from the perspective of recognition. It's significantly important that we pay particular attention to goals 3, 4, 5, and 10. So thanks very much. I think I stuck very closely to my time of 20 minutes. If you have any questions, you're very welcome to ask. I just want to put it back. Yeah.
So are there any questions from the floor, just to start us off? Okay, there's two there.
Okay. I just want to... Thank you, Ronelle. Apologies, I come from the physics department, so I'm not very au fait with some of these concepts. I just wanted to just get a clearer idea of your idea of recognition. Who recognizing who, or, okay. Or who recognizing what?
Yes, yes. I think recognition can be, let me just go back to that slide. I think recognition is a very important concept in terms, when we talk about it colloquially, we'll say, I recognize you, or I recognize you as someone who's different from me, but I also, I value the difference. But of course, And I think this is a really important point. It doesn't only operate at an individual and interpersonal level. Recognition operates at a structural level as well. And it is one of the components, as I said, that Nancy Fraser says is central to achieving social justice. Now let me talk about, and I'll go through that example again and perhaps give you another example. And it's central to my idea that if we don't know what oppressions or marginalizations are that people experience, we cannot address it. Let me give you an example. And I gave you the example of students. If we don't know that students, and I'll go into a bit of depth, we discussed it, Nazneen and I, in depth in the 2010 article. If we don't know that, if I'm a lecturer and I don't know that my student is waiting to borrow books from a friend who was able to afford to buy it, but they couldn't afford to buy it. So we have an essay due on the 20th, but now they must wait for the friend to actually finish their assignment so that they can then borrow the book in order to finish the assignment. So if I don't know that as a lecturer, I will perhaps say, okay, 2% off per day. You know, it's a very common thing that lecturers do. 2% off per day. And so it's not because the student, in fact, didn't have money to, didn't by no means of poor effort, but because of the structural reality of poverty. And so that's why, of course, if we understand that, we will perhaps, if the student speaks to us, be able to say, okay, look, I'll give you another 2 or 3 days without, a mark deduction. But we'll also be able to see how we allocate resources in terms of funding, and what are the things that actually are barriers to people achieving success, because this is, of course, all about access and success as well. So when we talk about recognition, it's not only about you and me recognizing each other, it's also recognizing and she calls it, Fraser, the cultural aspects of our experience that makes it difficult for us, or that enables us, remember it's recognition or misrecognition, that enables us to perform well. I think what is really important, and I mean there are many examples. It's issues like so I gave you an example of class. There are issues around language. There are issues around gender. Let me give you a great example. I know you were a teacher in your day. Let me give you a great example about gender from a school context. If I have 10 students in my class, and this is a real example from that I heard recently. If I have 10 students in a class, and there's only one woman, one girl in my class, this is my matric class, and I am a male teacher, and we now have a very close relationship because there's just 10 of us doing history. And I'm a nice guy, you know. I get on really well. I recognize people on an individual and interpersonal level. But when I get into the class on a Monday, then I will say to the guys in the class, hey, how did Manchester United do? How did the soccer game go over the weekend? And what does that do to the one girl in the class who may perhaps not be interested in soccer? You know, sometimes you hear young people talking about the lad culture. And then as teachers, we must be very careful that we don't engage in the lad or queen bee culture with students, because that, in fact, what seems to be being nice to people, in fact, is a significant misrecognition of that person and the cultural and identity aspects that they bring into the class. So what does that then do to that girl in the class? It silences her. It perhaps irritates her to hell and gone, so that she thinks it's not important to do history. And I think we can play around with examples like this in multiple ways. Did I explain well enough for a physics professor? Thank you. Okay. I think the lady behind you had a session, and then I'll take your question. Okay, thanks. Mm. Mm. Mm.
So I'm just trying to problematize again this notion of recognition proposal in one level, structured, and then how it takes down to
Mm.
it again.
Mm.
Because there's an element of like a gap there.
Mm.
And how do you actually quantize both structure and the concrete in that level? Then there's a question again of where protest, I mean a lot of protest theory around social movement theory, one of the key markers is speaking about recognition, the demands, whether people are struggling for oil in Nigeria, Egypt, where whatever, it becomes a key marker of like speaking to the structure and recognizing our own struggles.
Mm.
So how do you then like radicalize that? Because the danger with some of the examples that you put, it can be very paternal, like people recognizing the person who is there or recognizing the struggle of the students that without actually perpetuating in a context where capital has a way of mutating. Because it can easily incorporate those recognitions.
Yep. Yep.
Easy. For the fact that your slide also says the end. It just shows the magnitude of like how much it has incorporated these terms. So how do you move away from that, yet at the same time, perpetuate, or how do you break from that? So again, questions of structure in relation to that. So I'm just curious how you do that.
Thanks, that's an excellent question. You know, I think there are two components to your question. Firstly, how do you trickle this down? You know, how do you actually how do you educate around this? And then secondly, how do you engage with this in more radical ways? Okay, is that correct? Now, let me answer the first question, and I'll give you an example. Some of my colleagues are at UKZN are involved in really interesting research around gender-based violence, for example. But if you don't know what gender-based violence is, you're not going to recognize it and work towards stamping it out. Now, what did they do? My colleagues Nadine de Lange and Professor Lebo Maletsane, they did a participatory study with students that in fact asked them to take photographs in spaces where they in fact would, or photographs of examples that they would define, and spaces that they would define as being spaces where gender-based violence is likely to occur on campuses. There was a similar project at UWC, for example, where people, some colleagues of mine, Tammy Schiffer and Sisa and Gbaza, did work looking at what people see as unsafe spaces on campus. And what they did with those photographs, and this was part of the education, was to hold talks and to create posters that were contextual and very clearly identified where the problem areas are, and in fact got students together. Sorry, I'm looking in this direction because I'm speaking to you. Where students, in fact, could highlight it and engage with it in terms of their own activism through the Gender Equity Unit. Let me give you an example. At UWC, for example, and I'm going to go back to UKZN. At UWC, for example, students indicated that there's a wide open space which people use during the day as a parking area opposite a pub on campus. And they said that is one of the most unsafe areas, right? Then, in fact, at UKZN, some people talked about toilets being unsafe spaces. But what was amazing about that project was that, in fact, and in relation to gender, people could articulate it and externalize it. And that became part of their activism towards also engaging with policy and with university management, because here they had hard data as to what the spaces were and how they could change it. Now, I think the story about social movements is an interesting one, because if one can perhaps say that there would be interventions could happen on a continuum from very paternalistic to, in fact, very radical interventions. And I think many people have, and I mean there's a diversity of radical interventions that say, we, in fact, some people will say they would not work across, they would not work as individuals because, and on an interpersonal level, that social movements itself is going to be central, and protest central social movements is going to be central to effecting change. So in terms of gender, and I'm going to talk a bit about that on campuses, many people are still trying to evaluate the impact of the rape culture campaign, which was a national campaign on campuses, and which is, has been in the last 3 years a significant campaign. You will see it's an issue that is not specific to South Africa. I think on one of the countries that I showed earlier from the Africa Education Review, issues of gender and protest as a social movement, and certainly on the Africa edition, it was certainly not only students, it was people from civil society as well that engaged in whole-scale activism around issues of gender and specifically gender-based violence. Does that to some extent answer your question? Okay, right, okay.
Oh,
okay, you had a question? You're right? Okay.
Oh, I have the mic, Prof. It's here.
Oh, hi. Welcome.
So, Prof, so I wanted to preface my question with a reference to a greeting in isiZulu, Sawubona. That speaks into recognizing that individual, coming with their lived experience, coming with their, recognizing their existence within their space, and also their presence, right? And I wanted to ask a question and take it back home to Stellenbosch University and ask, especially when you're moving into the next centenary, how do we then foster an institutional culture of recognition, especially at an institution founded on exclusion and misrecognition rather than recognition? For example, you can speak about the denial or the misrecognition of rape culture on our campus, right? The misrecognition of poverty, language also as a form of exclusion that was misrecognized within this institution. A mere 9 rand as a form of financial exclusion that was misrecognized within this institution. So how do we then foster an institutional culture of recognition, because we say that we are an Africa-centered institution that is global in reach, right? So how do we go back to those African values of being able to recognize, not only recognize a person's existence within the space, but in their presence and also lived experience? Thank you, Prof.
Oh, Lonwabo, you're giving me hard questions here. I think you're absolutely correct. Unless the culture changes, every single time every issue arises, it will be an issue. So it will range from food security to transport, to it will range to accommodation. Because if we don't, and I'm going to answer the question broadly, if we don't think about how we transform institutional culture to, in fact, enable the practical aspects that I talked about now, and balance that with, of course, the fiscal requirements that's necessary, or let me talk simply, the money that's necessary to fund that, then in fact, then in fact, we are not fostering a culture. I think what's important is that we should have frameworks that we work with. It's very important to have ways of conceptualizing frameworks as to how one will deal with haves and have-nots, because we live in a society of inequality. How are we going to address issues of inequality? And I mean, I think there are a couple of examples of what people do. Because what that will leave us with is, in fact, us being reactive. We'll have a model of intervention that is reactive, and we will react to every single issue that comes up. What we would like to have is a proactive frame. And I think that is probably the best answer I can give you at this point around issues of exclusion. And of course, then inclusion on campus.
Cool. So,
sorry,
thanks.
I didn't watch who.
It's me. Thanks. Just maybe quickly to follow up on what Lonwabo asked. You know, we come into a space recognizing that the institutional culture is something that has to be, you know, attended to. And we come into the space with our troubled knowledge. And that for me is our inability to recognize our hidden, you know, stereotypes and prejudice, you know, how prejudiced we are, you know, across board. And the fact that we need to relearn and unlearn certain forms of, you know, behavior in interaction. And for me, it seems if the focus is more on transforming the institution rather than self-transforming ourselves, as a form of initial recognition that has to happen, that how do I deal with my troubled knowledge and troubled memory, in instance, so that I can be at ease when I, as Lonwabo says, when we say Sawubona, I see you in your totality, but also I see myself with my own totality, and I'm comfortable with that, and I'm able to engage. And I think this is the issue now, to say to me that some of our staff members are sympathetic to the cause of the students, because it's not only about the rands and cents, but it's also about the equity and the social justice element that's attached to that. And that's where you have these competing arguments. So how do we begin now to you know, to make sense of this thing that we're grappling with, to say how far can I be involved? How far can I make sense? Whereas this institutional culture which I can use to hide it, you know, from, say, it's part of the culture, but also, you know, when I want to come in, but I also need to recognize that I'm broken. And how do I do that, and then to become a better and effective person that can help myself, but also the institution and those students and colleagues that are also, you know, grappling to things.
Yeke, thanks. I think that's a very important point that you raise. I think, of course, structural and institutional repair goes hand in hand with personal and interpersonal mutual recognition and repair. They don't exist outside of each other. And I think Prof. Pumla Kabodo Madikizela is an expert on that issue. And of course, if I'm not able to recognize my troubled history and what that has done to me, and to do work to change and repair that in relation to others, then I can't expect others to do that, but I'm left off the hook. And I think, if I think of two simple words, it's words like care and compassion. And the author Michelinos Zembalus, who I'm sure you know, speaks quite significantly of the importance of not only psychologizing feelings, that feelings can also be structural. And if one makes that jump, then in fact, it's an important opportunity to engage in productive relations. So when I see you, and I am angry with you, let's say, for example, we're discussing issues of poverty. I'm angry with you. Then, in fact, it's not only an intrapsychic, and some psychologists will argue with me, but it's not only an intrapsychic and interpersonal feeling. It's a feeling that has a history and that is socially constituted as well, that in fact allows me to engage in that way with you. And so I think it's a very important issue that you raised, that it's interpersonal but structural, and it's at that at the same time. It doesn't exist today. I'm going to put on my interpersonal and intrapsychic jacket, and tomorrow I'll put on my structural jacket. It's always there, and it's always one, and always changing as we navigate our way through life.
Thank you so much. Due to time constraints, I'm going to have to take the last question. Okay, I'll take you. These are going to be our last two questions. So please, can you just keep them to short? Thank you.
Hi, Ronelle, thanks so much for the book, and Rob as well, and also including student voices in the book. I feel sometimes that we've praised ourselves so much last year. People felt that they just had to celebrate all the time. But I feel that so many of the issues that you've raised today about obstacles to poor students, we've raised over the last few years. And I feel after the 2015 protests, there have been so little engagement between students and staff, because it was almost as if the way that the university reacted with violence towards the protest either co-opted students into the system or just put them off completely from engaging. And we have so many committees at the university where you have a transformation committee in the faculty, or a food committee, but I very seldom get the impression that in a committee or in a working group that there's equality between the students and staff. It will always be, the committees that I have served on are always favored always favor the people in power, so that you will have one student or maybe two students just as a token, but they don't really have a voice, and they're too shy to really say, talk about poverty or real issues. So I would really like to see much more trust building, constant trust building between students and staff, and that we're not opposing factions almost. And then just with regards to the silos in which we operate as academics and as administrative staff, we know that the administrative staff also have a huge load, and especially with regards to bursaries, etc. And I know that some of them give students money out of their pockets, you know, I know that. But I feel there's not a coordination between the different groups on campus. And I'll give you an example. I serve on the food committee. So we've had a few meetings last year to try and avoid students going hungry. There's another food project, the Move for Food. And then last week I asked in my class, I said, people, I don't want you to sit in class and be hungry. And then a lot of students came to me and they said that they had not received food money, you know, and it was something. Then we walked to the bursary office, then I realized it's a pin that IntelliMoney had to send them. It was a practical thing, and I felt that I'd wasted my time on that food committee trying to alleviate poverty, but there's no communication between the bursary office, the food committee, and the food, what's the other one? Move for Food. It's a practical thing, but I felt so frustrated that I thought we were making progress, and it's just a practical thing. Maybe communication, better communication. If students and staff were together in more of the meetings, we would know more about what the needs are, and not always talk on behalf of students. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Would you like me to respond to it? Shall I? Yeah. Look, I think there are many staff members who do things in their little, little echo chambers, and I think, you know, I can only support what you're saying, that there must be a kind of a coordinated grouping and movement that works across the various parts of the institution in order to enable students getting efficient and effective service delivery, if one wants to use that word. But I think what is very important in this is that we live in this, and I'm going to say it, machine called the higher education institution. And I'm not talking about Stellenbosch. It's like this globally, where, and I'm going to use the word neoliberalism, and I don't have a lot of time to explain it, because we're part of a neoliberal corporate organization where everything focuses on this massification of higher education systems. Students become customers. We're operating like a corporate. Students become customers. All staff members are working 28 hours a day. All staff members. And so whatever is extra, so people actually create their little silos. Because everything that's extra, and this is extra, takes a toll. And I'm going to say also a psychological toll, as well as a toll in terms of people's physical health. So I think what is really important, so it's these, I think when one traverses a higher education space, whether you're staff or student, because we all engaged, all of us, from the bottom up to the top down, to the left, to the right, all of us that traverse higher education institutions are involved in this treadmill. And since the 1980s, the treadmill has sped up. And in fact, it's running faster than I can run at this point. And I think that I'm using that image because that is what the lived experience is for many people in higher education. And I think if one steps off that treadmill for a little bit to go and assist students who are having really, really severe psychological symptoms, Or if you as a lecturer get a call, Prof, this friend of mine is suicidal and I can't deal with it. Can you please speak to her? If I get a call like that, I want to do it because I don't want that particular person that I know to end up as a suicide statistic. So I go, and I'm going to give you a practical example. I go at 5 o'clock, and I go and see the student in her room, and she apologizes because her bed is not made, and I say, okay, I'm used to that. I've got daughters too who don't make their beds. So we sit and chat, and I ensure that she then goes to student counseling services. Because that interaction facilitates a distrust of a service at the university. But in order to do that, it means that I am now delayed for 2 hours, and I get home at 10 o'clock at night instead of 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock. And I give that practical example, and I'm not the only person that does that. Here are hundreds of staff members who do this kind of thing. Because we care about what happens to students, we care about what happens to other staff members. And I think, but I've given you a very practical example because it shows how, in fact, it becomes part of a larger system that you have to step out of and bear the consequences of that willingly. So, I mean, and that is part of what the neoliberal system of higher education does. Some people say the factory in which we work.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Very quick. I think that for me, a really critical question is to ask a question around power. You know, like, where does power sit? And who has the power to see, and who has the power to recognize and to maybe deliberately misrecognize? Yeah. And I think that over time we have seen spaces where we shift the power, that dynamic in the conversation shifts and the recognition shifts. Social media is one of those equalizers where power has shifted. Documenting and writing articles and publishing is another method where power shifts. And I think that it's very critical for us to explore different ways to shift the power instead of saying, please recognize this issue, when the powers that be clearly do not have the ability to see, is to focus on alternative ways of recognizing what the issues are that need to be prioritized.
I can't, yeah.
Yeah. That's right. That's right.
And I think it's very important that we can't do these kinds of things on our own. Collaborative work has always been more productive, and so I completely agree with you that there's a way of in which we must claim spaces and work collaboratively in claiming spaces. Okay, thanks very much. Having said that, I've got a meeting at 2. But I can be late a little, 5 minutes late. So.
Thank you so much to everyone for their really engaging and thoughtful questions, and thank you so much again, Prof, for presenting what I think is perhaps, you know, the core of perhaps the Centurion itself, questions and conversations we should be having. And thank you to the museum once again for having these conversations and creating the space as well. I'd like to invite everyone to also keep watch of the university's Facebook page to see what the following conversations are for Forward Fridays. Like I said, it's every Friday from 1 to 2. And for my fellow students, there's also snacks afterwards, so it's a great way to get in that Friday lunch meal after class. Thank you so much once again
and
to
just
everybody.
to say, next week I'm going to be part of a panel as part of the Woordfeest. We're going to be talking about leadership and student mental health. Student leadership and mental health.